Hey, this is Kyle Benedict with MISO BIM. This video is part 2 of our beginner level course in dimensioning. In part 1, we showed you the different dimension types that exist and how to use them. And in part 2, we're going to show you all the parameters that make up these dimension types and how you can manipulate them to show what you want to show graphically in your construction documents. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is just place a basic dimension. And I'm going to select this and go to the drop down menu in the properties, and you'll see if you're using Revit 2017 there are about 10 or 12 pre-made dimension types. I'm not going to go through every one of these because this video will probably be 3 hours long. What I'm going to do is just pick one, show you the quick differences between this particular arc length type, and you can make inferences to the differences between the rest. But what I'm also going to do is go into the type properties of one of these and show you how to change things in the properties, and that will allow you to customize dimensions any way you want if the preloaded ones aren't to your satisfaction. Okay, so we did arc length, 3/32 aerial. That's the dimension type and the text type. If I change this to line leader, nothing looks like it changes there, except if I pull the dimension out, you'll see there's now a leader. If I go back to the regular arc length one, that's an arc. If I go to the third type of the arc length, you'll see the line leader is text above rather than inline text. And you'll see the text is above the leader line. So we've got line leader text above, line leader inline text. Text is right in line with the leader. And then finally, your standard arc. Alright, so now let's look a little closer at the parameters within the type properties of these dimensions. As you can see, there's quite a bit here, and I'm not going to go through every single one like I said. A lot of them are pretty self-explanatory, especially a lot of the text options, because that's pretty standard across the board in Revit. So I'm going to pick a few parameters that I think will be important for you to know when it comes to customizing your dimension annotations the way that you or your firm wants to do it. Okay, the first one is going to be show leader when text moves away from origin or beyond the witness lines. Sometimes it is convenient on a long dimension string just to simply move the text over a little bit for clarity purposes. When moving away from the origin is selected, you're going to get a leader as soon as you move it. If we change that to beyond the witness lines, you can essentially move the text anywhere in between the two witness lines, which are these, without having a leader pop up. So I'm going to hit OK, show you what that looks like real quick. So the text is outside the witness lines, so we're getting a leader. But as soon as I move it inside there, you can see that no leader pops up until I get outside the witness lines down here. And again, where that comes in handy is if I've got a long dimension string and maybe I've got a grid line going through there, I can simply just slide this over a little bit, which makes the drawing read a lot clearer without having an awkward leader pop up in there. Alright, the next parameter I want to touch on is the center line symbol. This is pretty straightforward and basic, but it is good to know that it is here and how to activate it. So this will pull up any sort of symbols that are in your project, which is why you're seeing the north arrow. But in this case, we want the center line, obviously. And Revit will recognize whenever you are dimensioning to the center line of an object. So we'll hit OK. And now I'll just make another dimension between this to the center of the bed, to the center of this bed, and to the wall here. As you can see, the center line symbol is automatically activated right outside the witness line when it touches the center of the bed. This also works for really any object. As long as that object has a center reference point, Revit will understand that that is the center of the object and automatically create that center line dimension. If you just did it as a regular dimension, it will just look like a normal dimension with no center lines. This also works for the center lines of walls. So like I said, almost any object in Revit can be dimensioned to its center, and you can have these center lines activated by using that center line symbol parameter. Next, I'll touch on the color. The color is very straightforward. Obviously, we can just simply choose a predetermined color or choose any color from the spectrum here. But where this is helpful, and I've seen this done before at a few firms I've been a part of, is to make a rounding dimension. So we can say 3/32 aerial, 1/4 inch rounded, and our rounded dimension will be, let's say, orange. So I change the color to orange, which helps you know that any dimension with that color in your project may be a rounded dimension, and you may need to review it or go back to it. That goes hand in hand with the units format. So by default, that is checked to use project settings, which would be up in your Manage tab. But if we uncheck this for these specific dimensions, we can choose between all these options and also the rounding option, which is right here. So since I called this 1/4 inch rounded, we'll do it to the nearest 1/4 inch. Hit OK. And once I hit OK here, you'll see it's to 1/16 of an inch right now. That should round up to 7 foot 1 1/4. And there you go. And also, once I deselect it, you can see that the dimension is orange. Now, when you have multiple strings of dimensions, so let's say we've got these walls dimensioned, and then we're going to do an overall dimension, you'll see that as I get to a certain point past this dimension string, my dimension string that's active right now is snapping to a certain distance. And that's the next parameter I'm going to touch on, which is dimension line snap distance. Again, this is pretty straightforward, but this is where you can control it. So right now it's set at 1/4 inch. I'm not going to change that because you know what it'll do, but that is where you can adjust it, and that helps keep your dimensions neat and tidy, because every time you go past, it will snap exactly to 1/4 inch and make your dimensions look and read really well. Speaking of looking and reading really well, let's talk about transparency and opaqueness of the dimensions. So right now you can see where the text of the dimensions are. We've got a break in the object below, so that the line of that bed looks to be white right under the 5 foot 4 inch mark right there, and also right there. That's because our dimensions are set to opaque right now. But we can change that right here with the text background to transparent. So again, this is another option that will help your dimensions read a little bit better and a little more clear. Sometimes you do want it transparent, other times you do want it opaque. That might be something you'd want to put in the name of it as you duplicate these, but you'll see as I hit apply, now you can read the lines right through the dimensions. And again, sometimes that's good, other times that can get a little clustered and you want to go back to opaque, and now you can read the numbers a little bit better. And the very last parameter I'm going to touch on is the equality text. So as we talked about before, when you have equal spaced objects with your dimension string, Revit will automatically change that to say equal rather than the distance itself. We chose that in our instance parameters, but why was Revit calling it EQ instead of equal, equal, equal? Well, that is controlled right here. So whatever you type in here, that will be what is defined if you have the equality display changed to equality text rather than value. So now when I change this to equal, you'll see the dimension says equal, equal, equal rather than EQ. You can change this back just simply to EQ, hit OK, and there it is. So those are the main parameters I wanted to touch on in your dimensions. Again, most of the other ones are pretty straightforward, and I encourage you to experiment with them the best you can. And that concludes our video on dimensioning.